Bad first impressions lead to a rift forming between two members of the British upper class. I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that I believe was on my TBR for 2025, and it's also about both Pride and Prejudice. I am referring to Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which was published in 1813. For those who don't know, Jane Austen was a British writer who lived between the late 1700s and the early 1800s. She actually died pretty early due to some form of cancer, which is unfortunate for her. But she managed to write quite a bit of literature in her time, including Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, which was her first published story, Persuasion, which was published after her death, and also Mansfield Park. So many different stories, all of which focused on the British upper class, because Austen was a part of the British upper class, focused on issues of feminism and love and marriage and those kinds of ideals. I believe that Persuasion in particular focuses on an engagement that was broken off and people re-explore it later, which I'm looking forward to maybe checking that one out. That sounds pretty interesting. A lot of people liked Jane Austen in her time, but years after she was published, they sort of reflected how maybe she wasn't that great. But I think since then, in the modern era that we're in, this contemporary era, people view her as a big influence and also a decent author, which I have to agree with based on what I've read here. Let's talk about Pride and Prejudice. Without further ado, I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Pride and Prejudice focuses on the Bennet family. They are moderately wealthy family with daughters, looking to marry off those daughters to a family of much higher esteem, a higher social class, because they're moderately wealthy, but they don't really own their estate. The estate has been promised to a Mr. Collins, who we meet later in the story. Elizabeth really, the story focuses primarily on Elizabeth, who really cares for her sisters, wanting the best for them. She's a very headstrong woman as well and stubborn. And at the beginning of the story, a man named Mr. Bingley moves into the sort of general neighborhood. And the sisters maybe want to marry him, because it'll, again, give them better connections and whatnot. So they go to one of his parties, and there they meet Mr. Bingley, who is pleasant, and also a Mr. Darcy, who is a bit of a bore. People don't really like him. He's standoffish. So people are mostly frustrated with him. And Elizabeth overhears someone talk about her to Mr. Darcy. And Mr. Darcy replies that she's handsome, but not enough to tempt me, suggesting that he doesn't like her, which sort of poisons the relationship a bit early on, bad first impressions and all of that. A short while later, Mr. Collins finally arrives at the estate, talking about perhaps uniting the family, as he's a cousin, which is weird, but that's what happened at the time. Mr. Collins proceeds to try to woo maybe one of the daughters. They also gossip about Mr. Darcy and how he's not that great of a person. Elizabeth in particular talks to a Mr. Wickham, who reveals that maybe Mr. Darcy interfered with his ability to increase his social standing at one time, or affected his money in some way. Elizabeth doesn't know the full story, but again, she doesn't really like Mr. Darcy, so she's willing to listen to this Mr. Wickham. Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth turns him down. She rejects him. Her mother is unhappy, but her father is just like, it's your choice. Do what you wish. And in fact, Mr. Collins then proposes to Elizabeth, one of her sisters, who accepts it because she knows what this will bring to the family, and the esteem that it'll finally bring. Like Elizabeth is willing to do that, whereas Elizabeth's sister was willing to do that. I don't think I wrote down Elizabeth's sister's name. It turns out Elizabeth's sister Charlotte accepts the proposal for all the reasons I previously listed. And Jane gets engaged to Mr. Bingley, but when he leaves for London, he writes a letter saying that he might not come back. And that suggests that he's decided to break it off with Jane, who is deeply saddened by this. And Elizabeth hears rumors a short while later that Mr. Darcy convinced Mr. Bingley not to end up with Jane because she was of a lower social status, and that deeply frustrates Elizabeth. And when he returns a short while later and proposes to Elizabeth, she straight up rejects him, telling him to essentially fuck off, which is amazing. She's just like, you've upset Mr. Wickham, and you've ruined my sister's shot of love, of getting married. Why would I want to be with someone like you? And he admits to doing that, but says she doesn't know the full story about Mr. Wickham. And the next day, he gives her a letter where he outlines why he did what he did. He says that Mr. Wickham was the son of a steward of his family, and they grew up together, and he was promised some money. And he was given that money, but he kind of squandered it all and demanded more. And he tried to marry Georgiana, Mr. Darcy's sister, and then broke off the relationship when he wasn't going to be given the money that he thought he was owed. And that upset Georgiana. And Mr. Darcy, in the letter, says that he felt the same thing was going to happen to Mr. Bingley. He didn't want his friend to be hurt because he didn't think that Jane actually loved Mr. Bingley, although Jane is just more of a shy individual. Like Elizabeth tells Mr. Darcy that, and he's like, oh, and she also realizes that she was wrong to assume so much about Mr. Darcy, and she cries to herself. It's a very sad moment in the story there. While Elizabeth is sad, she travels with some friends and eventually goes to Pemberley, where Mr. Darcy lives, and it's kind of awkward between them. But it's very clear that Mr. Darcy still loves her. But Elizabeth doesn't really know how to deal with that right now. She has to leave Pemberley when she receives a letter that says Lydia ran off, and she ran off with Mr. Wickham. And they don't really know where she is. They manage to search for her and realize that she's in London, but they're not getting married, which can disgrace the family a little bit. And eventually Mr. Wickham agrees to marry Lydia. They have a wedding, and Darcy is there at the wedding, which suggests that he spoke to Mr. Wickham, gave him a little bit of money to make all of this happen, and thereby saved the family from some scandal there. And then a short while later, Mr. Bingley and Jane get re-engaged and get married, again by Mr. Darcy's doing, which wows Elizabeth because she sees what he's willing to do to sort of make up to her. And then a short while later after that, Lady Catherine shows up, who wants to know if Elizabeth is going to get married to Mr. Darcy. And Elizabeth doesn't really answer yes or no and says it's up to Mr. Darcy who he proposes to, but Lady Catherine says if he proposes to you, I urge you to say no because he's actually promised to his cousin, my daughter. And Elizabeth says, I'm not going to say no if he in fact asks me. And a short while later, again, Darcy shows up and asked to get married to Elizabeth, which she agrees. And he says he was even kind of testing to see, how she would respond to such an engagement by listening to what Lady Catherine had to say or something like that. They get married, and then presumably they live happily ever after, and that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, boy howdy, is there quite a bit worth talking about with this story. I will say, in the beginning, it was kind of a struggle to really get through, but eventually, I think around the halfway point, that's when it really took off for me, with Elizabeth pretty much calling out Mr. Darcy, even if she was wrong about it. And a lot of critics have said, when you're talking about this story, you can't be bogged down by the title, like Pride and Prejudice. That's not what it's actually about. The story was originally going to be called First Impressions, but Jane Austen changed it after the success of Sense and Sensibility. But I do think it's kind of weird to ignore titles. Stories are called what they're called for a reason. The author's trying to call your attention to something. So I do think it's important to talk about both Pride and Prejudice as being the main theme. So, in terms of analysis, like one of the things that when Jane Austen is talking about here is pride. Both Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy both put stock into their social perception and their egos. They're very kind of self-centered in a way. Mr. Darcy is very focused on his inner world, which comes off as a bit harsh to people who are not Mr. Darcy, including Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is very headstrong and is, definitely cares what others perceive in her family. And she has her own ego, and Mr. Darcy is kind of attracted to that, but it causes a few rifts because of how prideful these two individuals are. A lot of it is due to the social class and expectations of the time. Like if Elizabeth doesn't care about the perception of her family, there might be a scandal. There might be a bad outcome where the family isn't able to marry up, isn't able to sort of get out of this position that they're in and live a better life or something like that. A lot of it has to do with the growing feminism of the age, where Elizabeth wants to take control of her own life, control over her own body, which was beginning to rise, beginning to grow more and more. That's sort of her kind of her reactions to Mr. Darcy are a result of that. It's interesting because Elizabeth sees this pride as a negative quality. Maybe she doesn't recognize it in herself, but she sees the prideful nature of Mr. Darcy, and she complains about it to other people who go on and talk about how it's a very human trait, even if it is negative. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. "Pride," observed Mary, who piqued herself upon the solidity of her reflections, "is a very common failing, I believe. By all that I have ever read, I am convinced that it is very common indeed, that human nature is particularly prone to it, and that there are very few of us who do not cherish a feeling of self-complacency on the score of some quality or other, real or imaginary. Vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us," which is a very fascinating quote, just sort of, distinguishing between pride and vanity. Vanity, what other people perceive of you. So that's, Elizabeth, how sort of like trying to understand how Mr. Darcy sees her, and Mr. Darcy vice versa, and really all these people of this esteemed social class and British society kind of trying to portray themselves a certain way in order to be seen a certain way. And then pride is, how you feel about yourself. And so Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy both have high opinions of themselves, and that's very human, as Jane Austen is talking about here. But as Jane Austen shows, like the violations of our pride, violations of how people make us feel about ourselves, can lead to destructive prejudices. It can lead us to do awful things, treat people terribly, and treat ourselves terribly as well. And we come to see how that affects the story. I'm about halfway through, and even as we get to the end, like all of this is sort of the result of pride, vanity, ego, those things. And again, another thing that Jane Austen is talking about here is prejudice. Because of bad first impressions, Elizabeth dislikes Darcy. Elizabeth feels that he's kind of a bore, kind of very interested in himself, not that great of a person, and so everything that he does afterwards, because she has that prejudice, only confirms what she already thinks of him. Like she hears what Mr. Wickham has to say, and she's like, yeah, that sounds like the Mr. Darcy that I have assumed existed, and so she's willing to believe Wickham, even though he doesn't really, she hasn't really heard like Mr. Darcy's side of things. She thinks he's too insufferable. The rumors from others, including Mr. Wickham and some of the other members of the community, and how he's interfering in matches between Bingley and Jane. Like that seems to be like a last straw for her. Like, how dare he do something like that and ruin her family's opportunity to move into a higher social standing, but also ruin opportunities for Jane to find love, which she feels is very authentic, whereas Mr. Darcy does not feel that it's authentic. And as I mentioned before, all of this comes to head with the proposal. Elizabeth pretty much lays out the reasons why she doesn't like Mr. Darcy in this moment. It's pretty good. Allow me to read you another quote from this. "From the very beginning, from the first moment, I may almost say, of my acquaintance with you, your manners, impressing me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others, were such as to form the groundwork of disapprobation, on which succeeding events have built so immovable a dislike, and I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed upon to marry," which is a pretty good quote. I would dare say one of the best pieces of writing that I've ever, highlighted on this channel, which is interesting because so much of the writing has been it was hard to get into, and I had to really watch the movie to sort of better appreciate the writing. But I do think that quote from Elizabeth, basically telling Mr. Darcy off, is really good, and because it highlights her prejudice. She's like, "I had not known you for very long before I was absolutely certain that you were the last person I'd ever want to be around," which she doesn't get to know a lot about him. In fact, we don't really find out a lot about Mr. Darcy until near the end of the story. So she's just basing all of this on what other people have said about what Mr. Wickham has said, and her first impressions. Again, that's the original title of the story there. And Elizabeth pretty much spends the rest of the story unlearning these misplaced prejudices, realizing that Mr. Darcy is a pretty groovy individual, and Mr. Darcy, for his part, also tries to unlearn these prejudices. He assumed that Jane didn't like Mr. Bingley, and he was wrong about that, so he tries to fix things. And I think what Austen is suggesting here is that when you fall into these prejudices, when you assume things are true with no proof, and when you allow that to sort of affect relationships, you're losing opportunities. Elizabeth almost loses a shot at love here, because she comes to find out, yes, in fact, I do love Mr. Darcy, but her blowing up at him midway through the story could have really ruined that. So, it's interesting that Austen is suggesting that. And again, many stories since then have already said that, so it might not feel like that interesting or that novel of a message, but for its time, it was a pretty big deal, especially because the upper class had so many of these kind of beliefs. But I would also say that Elizabeth is maybe right to be mad, because Mr. Darcy does interfere. She's right to hate him because he does interfere with Jane and Mr. Bingley's relationship, even though he knows nothing about Jane. He just assumes that the same thing is going to happen to him that happened to Georgiana, and interferes. And he's like, I don't want these people of lower social class interfering in this relationship and making things worse. So, he's being a classist jerk. And Elizabeth is right to call him out on that. So I don't necessarily see some of that prejudice as being wrong. I think she's right to sort of assume that he's going to be an asshole about things. And in fact, he is. But maybe that's not what Austen is trying to say, but that's how it comes off in the story. Jane Austen is also heavily talking about class here. Austen highlights the role of class and social standing in this story, specifically with Elizabeth's family, the Bennets, who are of lower social class, still pretty wealthy, but they don't have a lot of money for their daughters, and they certainly don't own their estate. That belongs to Mr. Collins. So if they want their daughters to have a better life, they got to marry them off to people who have higher social standing. And some of these people might not be all that great. Elizabeth comes from a less well-off family, but you would argue that some of these are bad matches. Marrying Mr. Collins isn't that great because Charlotte, doesn't love Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins' first choice was Elizabeth. Marrying Mr. Bingley simply because he's the nearest rich man isn't that great for Jane. Lydia marries for love because she runs off with a poor soldier in Wickham. Elizabeth marries Mr. Darcy for love, which is great, but you can see the prejudice and extreme situation that came before that point. I do think that Austen is kind of arguing that, marrying for these reasons isn't that great. Should these women be marrying these men? Should these men be seeking out these women before they develop themselves a little bit further? I think that's some of what the story is trying to touch upon. However, I do think that in talking about all of this, Jane Austen is really just highlighting rich people problems, stuff that I certainly can't relate to, and a lot of people who read the story can't relate to. I think a lot of the issue that, especially that Jane Austen isn't maybe considering because she came from a high social class, is that a lot of these rich people, they're worried about marrying people who are less than them. We wouldn't want to accidentally marry a poor and elevate them by mistake or something like that, which is what Mr. Darcy is kind of hinting at in the story. He doesn't want his friend to be wrong, but the underlying sort of supposition of that is that he doesn't want a street rat to marry his friend. He doesn't want someone who's of lesser social standing who's just marrying for opportunity rather than love, which is noble, but it's also underlying a persistent concern of the upper class and how they view people of lower classes. Does Austen realize these prejudices are kind of seeping into her own story? Maybe not, but again, it's a lot of the story is about rich people problems, and seeing this along with seeing that in the War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, it does sort of make you hate rich people and be like, why should I support these characters who would never support someone like me? There are some other good things about this story, though. Darcy proving himself to Elizabeth in an act of love is pretty well done in this story. Very heartfelt, very romantic in that how he's trying to sort of amend for some previous mistakes that he made. Elizabeth's realization that she was wrong about Mr. Darcy, and especially Elizabeth's sort of immediate guilt over yelling at him, immediate frustration with the fact that she was proven wrong. It's very sad. It made me feel so. Jane Austen clearly did some good writing there. And then these admissions of love are very tender in this story, very very heartfelt. Even though some of the writing isn't that great at times, or is very of its time. I still felt it. It still came off the page. I will say there are a couple other problems as well. Vague feminism. Again, I think Jane Austen wrote feminism pretty well in her stories. But it does seem like at times it's more vague because, again, you might be trying to say something about having these women marry these men. Should they be marrying these men, for money or something like that? But in the end they still marry these men. They still end up with them. There's no way of sort of trying to counter that by Jane Austen by having maybe Elizabeth not end up with Mr. Darcy and maybe waiting for something better down the road or being happy on her own. That probably wouldn't have flown well with her audience at the time. But in trying to, sort of engage with this dialogue of feminism, especially early feminism, I think she still falls into some traditional gender norm traps or things like that. And again, as I've said before, it does have a real slow start. It takes a while for it to build, which is, it can be hard to get into. And then it's also long-winded, especially with the writing in a way that people don't, talk anymore. Now, that's probably a problem of the time, but I found other stories of the time to be much more easier to get into, less long-winded. So perhaps that's just an issue with Jane Austen. But similar to War and Peace, because it takes so long to get into, because a lot of these problems that exist in this story aren't necessarily issues that everyday people deal with, well, to some extent. I do think that, kind of like War and Peace, this story really only works in an academic setting. I can't really recommend that people go out and seek it, even though it is pretty good. I do recommend that you go out and seek it, but also I can understand if nobody goes out and seeks it. If you just watch the movie instead, if you just sort of get a Cliff Notes summary of it, it can be hard to get into. Because of all the reasons that I listed, but I do also think that it is worth it in that way. Anyway, those are my mini thoughts on Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Pretty good story, a pretty solid story. I thought I was going to have a better experience. I did like it, but I thought I was going to have a way better experience with it because other people have proclaimed it to be pretty great. Like they've propped up Jane Austen's writing, and for good reasons, but they've also, I don't know, they just said this was a really great story. So I guess I was expecting more through all the hype, and it's still good, as I mentioned before, but again, it can be a real struggle to get through. So, maybe check this out from your local library, and if you happen to like it, definitely purchase it because it might be one of those stories that's, worth having, worth preserving in some way. If you have any thoughts on what I said here, let me know in the comments below. I would love to have a discussion with you about this story. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about Jane Austen if they don't already know. I have a feeling a lot of Western readers might already know who she is, or they can find out about this story if they don't know. Also join the Discord if you want to have further conversations about media, movies, TV, books, those kinds of things. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your prideful and prejudicial travels. Farewell.